Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. And let me thank the organizers, the Estonian government, more specifically the Cooperative Center of Excellence on Cyber Defense, who is a very close partner of NATO. And the contribution it brings, not just in training, education, exercise, but also in forwarding the analysis, the critical thinking on the way forward in this dynamic domain is key and is critical. And probably one could have seen how intense this interaction has evolved, especially in the last year or two. And as you might know, the Center of Excellence is accredited by NATO, but it's owned by its stakeholders, the nations that have formed it, and it has a mandate that is defined by these nations, but also linked with the NATO agenda, but is not fully the NATO mandate. Let me give you, to give you a sense of, intuitively, of what I'm dealing and the vision emerging security challenges that cover not just cyber defense, but also counterterrorism, energy security, WND non-proliferation. It hosts the strategic analysis capability. So to give you a sense, an intuitive sense of the challenges we face in general, but also specifically on cyber, let me start with an intuitive story, interesting story that is attributed to Professor Einstein. It's said that at one final year exam, after Professor Einstein communicated the theme of the exam, the questions, one of the most deserving students who studied the subjects of previous years immediately jumped up and made the observation, Professor Einstein, you might have made a mistake because the subject that you displayed is exactly the same one that was at last year's exam. To which Professor Einstein responded, well, indeed, it is the same subject and are the same questions, but make no mistake, this year I changed the answers. So very much like in this story, we are challenged with providing the new answers to the old question, perennial question, how to best assure the collective defense of allies. And I think the strategic environment is challenging us with these answers. I missed last year's CyCon conference because we were in the middle of negotiations of the new enhanced NATO cyber defense policy that was endorsed by Head of State and Government in Wales last year. Jamie Shea, my deputy and a good friend, and who is a really old-standing brand within NATO, was here and kind of gave you a flavor of the debate. What I want to do on this occasion is to give you a sense of the meaning of what has been decided and what has been included in this policy, then the way we implement it, and frankly, look also to actually the challenges we already face, because we are already obliged to give new answers to the same old question. And to give you the meaning of where we are, the state of play that I was asked to present, but also the challenges on the way ahead, I think I should give you a bit of a short perspective on NATO policy. I would say that it was a bit more than a decade ago at the Prague summit that NATO recognized the need to start at least with strong focus on defending its own networks, and there was the decision taken to create the NATO Computer Incident Response Center. So that was the first high-level focus on the subject. But it wasn't until 2008, it was at the Bucharest summit, and this was after 2007, the attacks, denial of service attacks against Estonia, that NATO actually launched its first policy, which was foundational. It established principles, some requirements for NATO's own networks. Is established also some governing structure. The Cyber Defense Management Board has been created. Also, the roles of different bodies and committees have been developed, but again, very much with a focus on NATO's own networks. In 2000, so this was NATO Cyber Policy 1.0, as one would call it. In 2011, after the adoption of the new strategic concept that put emphasis on the 21st century security challenges, we went on to what I would call developing a new policy, which was adopted in 2011, the 2.0, which was about consolidation and centralization of protection. What it brought as new elements was, number one, the inclusion of the provision for the centralized protection of NATO networks over 50+ sites to have a situational awareness given the distribution of NATO networks. It also established a number of political requirements, including assistance to allies, the start of developing of partnership or information exchange. And it was providing also for the inclusion of NATO cyber defense capability targets in the NATO defense planning process, which is NATO's mechanism to generate coherence and uniformity in developing of capabilities at nations. So it was a strong, significant way forward to address this in a big allied framework. And now I'm coming to the 2014 policy, the enhanced NATO policy on cyber defense, the 3.0. And I want to be a bit more granular, but still structure the novelty, what it brings in, like on three main layers. One, what it brought new in terms of conceptual approach, what I would call the widening of the cyber paradigm within NATO. And here you will see at least two significant steps forward. One is linking cyber defense to collective defense, which was not the case before, by the way, in the previous policies. The other one is recognition that international law applies in cyberspace. And the two have to be seen in link together. Why? Because let's be sure, NATO is not a source of international law, for example, and I'm starting with this subject. But it also was a strong message, I think, sent by heads of state and government that NATO doesn't have any interest to militarize the cyberspace or to have an ungoverned space. And it was against this context that also, on the other hand, the affirmation that cyber defense should be part of NATO's core task of collective defense, with one important mentioning that any invocation or link to Article 5 will be decided politically by allies on a case-by-case basis, so no automaticity or thresholds or so on. Also, this policy provided what we call a framework of assistance to allies, both in times of normal business, while supporting, developing their cyber capabilities, cyber defense capabilities, but also in times of crisis. And I think it's probably at this point that I should emphasize that the mandate of NATO in all these policies, including the one under which we're operating, is cyber defense. It's what it says. It's not as broad as cybersecurity. We don't deal with cybercrime, although we established partnerships and information exchange and so on. And we're not dealing with, for example, cyber warfare, or so it is focused, resilience-focused cyber defense, and it's important to have this in mind. It evolved from being focused on defending NATO's networks mainly, but it's now brought under the collective defense umbrella. There's another layer, the layer that I would call the reinforcing of NATO's cyber defense capabilities and capacity building. And here, there's a provision of moving on with developing NATO cyber defense capability targets, and we are now in a process of preparing the second cycle of capability targets. By the way, the first cycle was focused on quite important but generic things like having at level of each ally strategies, policy development, establishment of certs, and so on. Now we're looking to the next step. We also have recognized the role of multinational smart defense projects in the field of cyber defense. And so far we have three important projects where a number of nations, NATO nations, and in some cases also partner nations, participate in developing capabilities or capacity building. Number one is the so-called multinational cyber defense capability development projects, which establishes a framework of actionable information exchange, situational awareness, and then developing analytics with immediate applications towards mitigation. There's another one, the malware information sharing platform, and the third one, multinational smart defense on education and training. In terms also of these reinforcement of capabilities and capacity building, I should stress the emphasis put on training, education, and exercising. And from this point of view, interaction with the Center of Excellence has been superb. And let me go to the final layer that I called the new way of doing business that are included in the policy. And it's about new ways of doing business both inside NATO, in-house, through a streamlined governance process. We went through making this work better, roles of the committee, established a Cyber Defense Committee last year as a clearinghouse role before pushing decisions or recommendations to for the agreement by the NAC. The new terms of reference of Cyber Defense Management Board, the streamlining of cyber over all NATO's tasks, not just collective defense, but also crisis management and cooperative security, increased information exchange, but there's also about a different way of doing business with the outside world. And here I want to emphasize and come to the point stressed by Admiral Rogers. It is about partnership, because cyber defense is by definition team sport. No one can do it alone. And here we have a strong mandate in terms of developing partnership with partner nations, of course, on a case-by-case basis, because this depends on the number of issues, starting from, of course, from mutual interest, but also from a degree of development and advancement in the field of cyber defense, the degree of trust, and so on and so forth. It is about developing partnership with international organizations. And here I should say that we already have a structured staff-to-staff relationship with the European Union, and we're moving on towards advancing this. Last debates, for example, in Cyber Committee was about a recommendation for having a technical agreement maybe between NSEC-TC and CERT-EU to allow a framework for information sharing, not just on an ad hoc basis as it's happening right now, but also on a structured basis. We also established a relationship with OEC, and we had the OEC representatives in the Cyber Defense Committee discussing on confidence building measures, for example, in cyberspace. And this also shows that NATO is interested in the kind of development of norms. By the way, we have helped norms development and supported this through other means, like through the Science for Peace and Security program. We're also are engaged in partnership with the United Nations, Council of Europe. But what is, I think, a novelty in the policy, and I think an element of huge recognition of the role that the private sector and the academia plays in this field, is the fact that the policy provides for the NATO Industry Cyber Partnership, which has been launched. It's in the process of getting consolidated because, frankly, we did not start from scratch. We have started from mapping existing NATO industry partnership by Atlantic Command Transformation, for example, which has a long-standing track record. The agencies, the NATO Communication Information Agencies, also Defense Investment Division within NATO. We have for the first time introduced debates, political debates with industry representatives in the political committee, which is the Cyber Defense Committee that deals on the issue. We're looking forward for the recommendation by allies on a number of business cases on cooperation with industry. One is the so-called NICP gateway, so a single entry point to develop information exchange on different levels, including actionable information exchange. Another one is an innovation exchange to stimulate getting closer to the innovation cycle in the field and hopefully establishing also an innovation fund. So these are just a number of examples. This is what it brings new and where we are. We are now in a moment of working on the implementation of the new capability targets. We are doing the planning on the future exercises, Cyber Coalition 15, which will take place in autumn here in Tallinn and in Tartu. We are looking already to have cyber included in all NATO exercises, including CMX, the cyber defense, the crisis management exercise of NATO, which is planned for 2016, also in operational exercise. We're looking, we have already training education exercise plan over 5 years from now. So all these elements, partnerships with industry, with other organizations, with other nations, is going on, but in a context that is already changing. So what is changing? It's the threat landscape is changing as we speak, and we had a lot of recent briefings by nations and awareness building sessions to see this. We see the evolution in terms of development of norms and the understanding of international law in the cyber domain. We had council level presentation on this, and I see here Mike Schmidt, who was just a couple of months ago to brief the NAC, other presentation. We're looking on the so-called political guidance that will define concrete actions generally in NATO for the coming years. And what is really clear is that we're living in a changing strategic environment where NATO can depict an arch of, I would say, crisis along its eastern and southern border. This is where one would see things geographically, but also growing challenges coming from cyberspace or from terrorism, from the new technologies that are easily accessible, maybe from shortages that could be determined in energy supplies or others. And we have to adapt to all this. We see another thing, we see the application of hybrid warfare and an important cyber dimension of the hybrid warfare, which has fueled the debates within ACT. So it is actually another hot period of debate. And it's interesting to see how this will fuel the dynamic of evolution of the approach, because one thing is clear. We understand that you can never say you have addressed this domain full. There's always the next step. There's always the next need for adaptation. And I think the evolution of the cyber approach will be part of what we call the long-term NATO adaptation process in this new strategic environment on the way to the next summit that will be in Warsaw. And in this we are also very much counting on the partnership with academia, with industry, with the international community, with Center of Excellence like the one in Tallinn, to be able to get the new answers to the fundamental question how we can assure security and stability in a world of legality, where also freedom, privacy, and rule of law is prevailing. With this, I will stop, but I would be open to any of your questions.
Okay, please state your name and affiliation before asking a question, please.
Good morning, Piret Pernik, Center for Defense and Security. With passive defense posture of NATO, you can't go after attackers, and you will not help allies in planning for offensive capabilities. So I was wondering, how do you operationalize collective defense commitment in terms of crisis management and military planning, as you presumably need full spectrum of capabilities? Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for putting directly the finger on something which is extremely relevant, and frankly, it's among the aspects that are under vivid debate within NATO. So, it's clear that what NATO has invested itself in capabilities has been resilience-based, and we had the so-called NCIRC FOC project, this centralized protection, which was a 60 million plus investment, which is now operational, and it has put in function also gradually its analytical side. So this is about the investment in NATO's own capabilities. It is also known that nations develop different kind of, I would say, broader spectrum of capabilities. And since cyber defense is part of collective defense, that would mean that upon specific allied decision on a case-by-case base, any potential response will be defined. I would say that it was deliberately left, this issue of response on a potential cyber Article 5 scenario has been deliberately left under the so-called flexibility rule, and not to be threshold generated or prescribed. But at the same time, it is true, and I have to mention that one of the big differences in the debate today in NATO compared to a number of years ago is that there are no taboos. So all these the aspects of how cyber is regarded as an operational domain, aspect mentioned by Admiral Rogers, Again, in NATO, cyber is not an operational domain. At least we are not operating under this presumption. But what it means and what implications is discussed. And I don't know what the final decision will be, but it's part of the debate. I think also how to link, I would say, the larger spectrum of capabilities by allies in planning mechanisms. Again, it is debated, but so far, you asked me how NATO is doing it. I think the responses to this will come up after this. The debate will mature, since at this moment we are operating under the resilience-focused cyber defense mandate. I should mention, before everyone thinks of putting another question, something that one of the colleagues from one of the delegation just mentioned. I think this increased interaction with representatives from academia, analysts, has generated a much higher level of understanding. I would also, somebody told me that we went through a kind of process of what is called demystification of some of the concepts that were seen as untouchable or being necessarily linked with something that should be untouchable. But so far, we are in the middle of the debate and the discussion, and we'll probably see the conclusions in the coming month.
If there are no more questions, then I would like to thank you, Ambassador, for your thought, and please also accept our gratitude.
Thank you.
Thank you.